Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. It had been barely 3 weeks since Cynthia C. Harper had crossed the threshold of the Jiu Jitsu school Reynolds Combat Academy, a small dojo nestled in a discreet industrial area of the city. C had never touched a kimono in her life, much less strapped on a belt to train in a martial art. She was a woman in her 30s, tall, athletic, but with no formal combat sports experience. This choice, however, was no accident. She had grown up in a neighborhood where unwritten laws reigned supreme, those of survival, mistrust, and toughness. An environment where you had to fight, literally and figuratively, just to exist. But Cynthia wanted something else. She wanted to learn to control herself, to channel the raw energy that had often saved her, but also put her in danger. For her, Jiu Jitsu represented a path to self-mastery, a discipline that required much more than physical strength. Work on the mind, patience, and strategy. The day she signed up, she was alone, almost invisible. The dojo smelled of burning tatami rubber, and the walls were covered with photos of past champions and competition posters. The atmosphere vibrated with an almost palpable energy, a mixture of adrenaline, focus, and ambition. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, Cynthia immediately felt the coldness hanging in the air. The majority of the students were young men, students, or professionals, all wrapped in their kimonos with brightly colored sashes, blue, brown, purple, signs of long experience. They warmed up in groups, exchanging technical advice, exchanging knowing and sometimes contemptuous glances. Their movements were sure, their confidence overflowing. Cynthia, by comparison, had a brand new kimono, neatly folded in a bag, which she had bought on credit after several weeks of saving her expenses. The fabric was still stiff, the bright white almost like a promise she wanted to keep. As she entered, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, some curious, others disapproving. A few murmurs began, like a quiet wave of judgment. Among them, a tall, sturdy young man with a smirk plastered on his lips made comments loud enough for those close to him to hear. "Look at her. She looks like she came out of nowhere. No chance she'll last a week here." This boy was Jake Peterson. He exuded a natural arrogance, that of a local champion, accustomed to being admired and never questioned. For him, Cynthia's presence was an incongruous intrusion into a world he had made his own. He liked to repeat that martial arts were not a game, and that here, no one gave gifts to those who were not worthy. And then there was Coach Brad Reynolds, a man in his 50s, his face marked by years of fighting and intensive training. He was the pillar of the dojo. His reputation as a demanding technician and uncompromising curator was well known. He had that cold authority that commanded respect and discipline, but also distance. His gaze, when it fell on Cynthia, was a mixture of indifference and skepticism. He said nothing aloud, but his expression betrayed what he was thinking. An inexperienced black woman with no martial arts background was not the ideal candidate for his school. Cynthia walked to a quiet corner, a space on the edge, where she set down her bag and knelt to put on her kimono. Each movement was an act of courage, a taking possession of this seemingly hostile place. The whispers resumed, sometimes accompanied by stifled chuckles. She raised her head, meeting several gazes, all heavy with judgment. Yet she remained motionless, focused. She didn't want to be pitted or belittled. She just wanted to learn. Coach Brad watched her critically. He didn't believe she would last, or that she could keep up. His warrior mentality, honed over years of training, told him not to waste his time on unpromising rookies. Right next to him, Jake whispered to a friend, jerking his chin at Cynthia, a defiant glint in his eye. "It won't last a week." This sentence was a judgment, a silent challenge to Cynthia, like an omen she intended to break. She forced herself to ignore the mockery, breathing deeply. These whispers, these judgmental looks, she had known them all her life. Since childhood, she had learned to ignore the judgments of others. At every step of her journey, there had always been people ready to underestimate her, to focus on her appearance, her gender, and her skin color before even trying to understand her determination. With each obstacle, she had to fight harder to prove her worth, not to others, but to herself. Because she knew that as long as she didn't give herself the means to follow her dreams, no one would do it for her. On the streets of her neighborhood, she had learned to stand tall, to never show her weaknesses. When others looked askance, she turned it into a strength. But here, in this cold, technological place, in this foreign world of jiu-jitsu, she knew the rules were different. She didn't have the advantage of experience or knowledge of techniques. She could only rely on her will and resilience. She took a deep breath, her mind centering on the present moment. This was the moment when everything she'd experienced up to this point, her trials, her failures, her silent victories, would converge to allow her to clear this first hurdle. She wasn't here to prove anything to Jake, to Coach Brad, or even to this room full of confident young men. She was here for herself, for her own respect, and that respect she was going to earn, no matter how the world wanted to see her. Coach Brad, still detached, seemed oblivious to the obvious tension in the air. He hadn't noticed Cynthia's determined gaze, or perhaps he had underestimated it. He turned toward the room in an authoritative tone. Okay, we're starting with basic holds today. You're going to practice controlling and knocking down your partners. Be quick, be precise. Pay attention to your position. He then turned to Cynthia, without an ounce of compassion in his voice, as if he'd just decided it wouldn't last. You'll start with Jake, he announced dryly. I'm sure you'll get along just fine. Cynthia nodded wordlessly, her heart beating softly against her chest, but her inner voice was calm, relentless. She walked over to Jake, who was waiting for her with a mocking smile on his lips, his arms crossed like a gladiator about to face his prey. Ready to be humiliated? He called out to her, a smirk tugging at his lips. Cynthia didn't respond, choosing not to get drawn into this game. She positioned herself, focusing on her breathing, on her body. Her movements weren't perfect yet, but she understood one thing. Everything in jiu-jitsu was about timing, self-control, and reading your opponent's movements. She had already developed these qualities in other facets of her life, even if they weren't as obvious. But here, on the mat, it was a whole new challenge. Coach Brad watched the scene with detached interest, his scrutinizing gaze wandering between the two partners, already certain of the outcome. Jake, with his experience, felt superior. He didn't believe for a second that Cynthia could pose a problem for him. The session began. Jake lunged forward with the speed of a predator, thinking Cynthia would be child's play. He lunged to grab her by the arms and wrestle her to the ground. But Cynthia, with a single, fluid movement, dodged his attack. Her movements were light, as if perfectly choreographed. She turned her body slightly, analyzing Jake's movement. Then, with almost surgical precision, she placed her leg under him and tripped him. He fell heavily to the tatami. The room froze. A heavy silence fell, as if time itself had stopped. The laughter had suddenly died away. Everyone, even Coach Brad, seemed in shock. What no one had seen coming was how Cynthia had used space, timing, and her agility to bring Jake down. She hadn't used brute force, but a simple, effective technique. And what was most striking was the quiet confidence with which she had done it. Jake sat up quickly, a little redder than before, but with a glint of anger in his eyes. He didn't like losing, especially not to a beginner, and certainly not in front of the entire room. He groaned, visibly embarrassed, but his bruised ego wouldn't let him back down. Okay, you got me once, he said, his tone now firmer, almost defiant, as he got back into position. But it's not going to happen again. Cynthia didn't answer. She was calm, almost implacable. She'd seen this kind of reaction 1,000 times in her life. The arrogance of men who can't stand to be destabilized. She didn't need to speak, to provoke him. She was going to prove it to him with her actions, not with words. She waited for him to make another move. Jake, more determined than ever, rushed forward this time with renewed vigor. But Cynthia, more calm than ever, caught him just as he let his guard down. In an instant, she slipped behind him, used her position to lock his neck, and executed a perfect choke, subduing her opponent in seconds. Jake tried to break free, but he could do nothing against the well-applied hold. The silence grew heavy. Then, finally, there was the sharp thud of the tatami mats as Jake slammed his fist onto the floor, signaling his defeat. The other students' gazes were frozen between disbelief and admiration, and Coach Brad, who had been watching without intervening, rubbed his chin, intrigued by what he had just seen. Cynthia stood up slowly, as if the gesture cost no effort. She remained upright, a slight smile on her lips, but he wasn't one to boast. She was simply satisfied with having accomplished what she had set out to do, prove that technique, patience, and strategy mattered more than brute strength. Coach Brad watched silently, his gaze a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. He wasn't used to seeing a beginner handle a student like Jake with such fluidity and calm. He'd underestimated Cynthia, but something about her technique had bothered him. He knew this wasn't normal. He wondered who this woman really was. After the session, the atmosphere in the room had changed, electrifying and charged with new energy. The students, still in shock, slowly gathered in the center of the tatami. Coach Brad, who until then had maintained a cold and distant posture, felt he could no longer ignore what had just happened. The weight of Cynthia's performance had resonated even in his convictions, shaking his certainties. He took a step forward, taking a deep breath to regain control of the situation, but unable to hide a new spark in his eyes. An almost respectful glint, mixed with a certain humility he hadn't known he possessed. "Cynthia, come here," he said, his voice more dry and formal than usual, with an obvious effort to maintain his authority. But behind this firmness, there was a slight surprise, almost the beginnings of recognition. Cynthia stepped forward, her muscles relaxing, but her posture remained proud and calm. She made no attempt to hide the satisfaction slowly rising within her, but her face remained impassive, perfectly in control of her emotions. That direct, frank gaze showed that she had already gained something important, restored dignity in the face of initial contempt. "Jake, come here too," Brad ordered, his hard gaze settling on the other student, who approached, more hesitant this time. His jaw was clenched, his eyes cast down, heavy with humiliation. He had been confident just minutes earlier, and now he was faced with a reality he hadn't wanted to face, that his arrogance had been punished. "Congratulations to you both," Brad continued, his voice calmer, but still full of gravity. Then, turning to Jake, he added firmly, but with a hint of reproach, "But, Jake, you see what happens when you underestimate someone." The silence fell heavy. Jake didn't dare answer, consumed by frustration and shame. He could feel the other students' gazes on him, a mixture of newfound respect for Cynthia, but also judgment. The other students, however, seemed suddenly awakened. The gap between their instinctive prejudices and the reality of what they had just witnessed widened before their eyes. Some looked at each other in astonishment, as if a truth had been revealed to them. Others bit their lips, realizing that they too had underestimated Cynthia, like so many others before them. Brad then turned to Cynthia, his voice becoming more humble, almost sincere. "Cynthia, you have a natural talent." His words were simple, but heavy with meaning. "You're the only one who managed to overthrow Jake in such a short time." He paused, searching for words, aware that this moment was going to be about more than just technique. "I'm asking you to stay after class to work with me a little more. There's a lot to learn, but you're clearly on the right track." She nodded, a small smile lighting up her face. It wasn't asking for anything, wasn't trying to impress, but it shone with a quiet victory. What she'd gone through to get to this point, the stares, the judgments, the mockery, it had all been transformed into a moment of personal triumph. She hadn't just knocked an opponent to the mat. She had knocked down a wall, an invisible but heavy one. The wall of prejudice, of hasty judgments, of racial and social stereotypes. This wall that so many people, in so many fields, had erected around her, and that she continued to deconstruct, one step at a time. The group, frozen until then, gradually came back to life. The looks were different, more respectful, as if a new era was dawning for this training room. Cynthia, despite her fatigue, felt carried by this energy, ready to continue, stronger than ever. The following weeks were a true transformation for Cynthia C. Harper. Every day, she walked through the doors of the Jiu Jitsu gym with the same quiet, almost unwavering determination. Her kimono, once immaculate and almost intimidating, now bore the marks of rigorous training, worn creases, sweat marks, evidence of silent but intense effort. Cynthia wasn't one to seek the spotlight. She stayed in the background, focused on every detail, every movement, always attentive to corrections and advice. Her progress was steady, impressive. Her body was becoming more flexible, her reflexes were sharpening, but it was above all in her mind that she was gaining strength. The self-control she had been seeking from the beginning was becoming visible, almost palpable. Coach Brad, who had initially regarded her with skepticism, with that mixture of reserve and doubt one grants to novices, gradually changed his attitude. He began to take her under his wing. She was no longer just another student, but a protégé, a project in which he wanted to invest his knowledge. He offered her personalized advice, patiently corrected her postures, and pushed her to exceed her limits. For the first time, he showed genuine pride in a student, and it showed in his eyes. The other students, those who had initially whispered and laughed when she arrived, had changed too. Their looks had transformed into respect, their murmurs into encouragement. Some even sought her out for advice or to practice with her. Cynthia had quietly become a model of perseverance and discipline, living proof that appearances and first impressions could be deceiving. Then came the crucial day, the black belt test, barely a month after her debut. The air in the room was thick with a palpable tension, a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Students, instructors, even the occasional observer, were waiting to see if Cynthia would succeed or crumble under the pressure. When it was her turn, Cynthia stepped forward with a sure step, without a tremor, without a hesitation. She was calm, almost serene. Every muscle, every gesture, every breath seemed perfectly controlled. From the first minutes, she displayed a series of movements, complex and fluid techniques, which testified to an intense apprenticeship and a deep understanding of the art. The holds she executed, the dodges, the reversals, all of this came together with a precision and speed that astounded the audience. It wasn't just strength that dominated, but strategy, finesse, and the intelligence of the body in motion. She drew on her years of living on the streets, where survival depended on attention, quick analysis, and unfailing resilience. As the final movement ended, a heavy silence fell over the room. Then Coach Brad stood up, looking solemn, and declared before everyone, "Cynthia C. Harper just got her black belt." The announcement echoed like a clap of thunder in the silence. A mixture of astonishment, admiration, and respect filled the room. Eyes turned toward her, some with genuine smiles, others with mute admiration, but all with gratitude. Cynthia knelt for a moment, resting her hands on the tatami, feeling the weight and honor of this moment. She hadn't just earned a black belt. She had redefined what it meant to be a fighter, for herself and for all those who had doubted her. She was proof that strength is not measured by skin color or appearance, but by the unwavering will to surpass oneself, to get up, and to move forward, always.